Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Give me 1 second. All right. So our panel today is Sacramento versus small cities, the housing battle. So today we're discussing the state's efforts to encourage and sometimes maybe force cities to make way for more housing and the tension that has caused between the state and the region's small cities. So we're joined today by Encinitas Mayor Tony Kranz, there at the end. State Senator Catherine Blakespear, who also used to be on. And then we have Coronado Mayor Richard Bailey. And then we have Executive Director of LISC San Diego, Ricardo Flores. For those who aren't familiar with LISC, it's a nonprofit that provides support to community development projects, including housing projects through grants, loans, and investments. Okay, so Senator Blakespear, we'll start with you. You recently voted in favor of a bill called SB 423. SB 423 extends the builder's remedy and some other housing provisions that were set to expire in 2025. The builder's remedy, for those who are not familiar, makes it easier for housing developers to build affordable housing projects in cities that don't have a housing plan that's been approved by the state. So the bill that you supported would essentially remove that 2025 expiration date of the builder's remedy, and it would expand the streamlining of housing development to the coastal zone, which includes Encinitas and Coronado. So 2 questions. Why did you support this bill? And do you think these kinds of housing laws that are meant to essentially force cities into approving housing projects are necessary?
Well, thank you for that great question. Is it working? Microphone?
Yeah.
So first, I just want to start by saying thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you to Voice of San Diego for hosting this, and Tigist also for reaching out in advance to have a pre-meeting and really make sure that she understood the issue from my perspective, and I appreciate the great reporting that you do in North County as well.
Thank you.
So I come from being the Encinitas mayor before my colleague here, Tony Kranz, and I know these 2 mayors on either side of me extremely well, and although this panel is set up as a state versus local, these are friends of mine, and so I'll be articulating and wearing the hat of the person who represents the almost 1 million people in the Senate district, and also is looking at state level policy, because we all have different responsibilities and we wear different hats. And so I'm no longer a mayor of a coastal community, although I was very pro housing when I was. And now as a state senator, I have the responsibility of looking out for the entire state. So I think what we see at the state level is that every city needs to do their part. So we have almost 500 cities in the state of California, and we need to have a process whereby there's a large amount of community involvement at the beginning of a planning process. With what are the values, what are the things that are most important to you, what do you want to see in your community? And then we have a process where housing can be built. And what we currently have is a huge number of delays at nearly every level, from administrative to legal to litigation, that stops housing. So it's really the running the gauntlet of those who want to build housing and provide more housing in this state in order to get something built. So my support of the bill that she was just talking about is really rooted in that. It's saying that we need to make it easier for housing that is compliant with state housing element, or with local housing elements, to be constructed. And I start from the premise that we actually do have a housing crisis, which is just a fact, which I think nearly everybody in the state should be aware of. When you look at the affordability and the homelessness epidemic, there are just huge numbers of poverty-driven problems that we face in our state because of our inability to provide enough housing. So coming from that perspective, supporting this bill and allowing us to have more housing that's built in coastal communities, which are very much part of the solution as much as inland communities, is the reason that I support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Kranz, I know you were part of a group of city leaders that sent a letter to state lawmakers urging them not to forward this bill. Why were you against it?
Well, I was against it because the impacts on the coastal, I think, are going to be significant. And I say that as a mayor who currently has approved from the housing element that he did get approved housing element. There have been about a half dozen projects that have been approved. Only one of which isn't in the zone. But SB 35 was correct when it exempted the coastal zone. The challenges of complying with coastal act through our local coastal program are significant. There are already a slew of state laws that impact local authority when it comes to housing. And I didn't think that it was necessary to add this to the list. Encinitas is compliant with the law. We got there by court order. The court gave us no choice but to comply with HCD. The history, I won't get too deep into it, but when Catherine was elected mayor in 2016 for the first time, I was reelected to the council. On that same ballot was a housing element update that the voters were asked to approve, and they didn't, which was unfortunate because an approved housing element was part of a settlement agreement that we had with the BIA and another local developer. So we were in a real box. And through Catherine's leadership, we started a housing element task force that I was a part of, which also included 2 citizens in our community, both of whom had planning commission experience. And we held about 25 meetings for the next year and a half, trying to find sites that we could get the voters to approve. And it will not surprise you to learn that with the need to upzone 15 sites in the city of Encinitas, we were not successful in 2018, which put us back in court. And that's when the judge said, you have no choice but to comply with housing law. And it's been very painful. Catherine and I didn't agree actually on the measure that was put before the voters in 2018. She was one of 2 votes to oppose the map that we came up with. Myself and 2 other council members approved it. Again, it went to the voters and surprise, it wasn't approved. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. You ask the community to approve something that's going to add 30 dwelling unit per acre projects to 15 locations in your city, and it's just about guaranteed it won't pass. So the challenge that we had in 2018 is that the legislature was so busy enacting more housing laws for us to figure out how to comply with. It was a nightmare, but we're living the nightmare. We have a housing crisis. I am pro-housing. Encinitas has become a city of CEOs because the working class people that do the jobs in our city can't afford to live. And I think that's a terrible situation. I'm the son of a PE teacher, a Marine, a World War II veteran, fought in battles in the Pacific. And he was a teacher. I'm one of 7 kids. My parents couldn't afford to purchase a home in Encinitas today. So we have a lot of work to do. I don't think necessarily that the legislature is helping us. They should come with money. Money is what we need. People complain about the infrastructure, the woefully inadequate infrastructure, traffic issues, water issues, stormwater issues, and the state does nothing to help the city address those issues. They just say build more housing. And I think it's time that they stop and pony up a little bit to help address those issues.
Regarding that, regarding what you just mentioned, the challenges that cities are facing in providing necessary infrastructure and services to support new housing developments, I want to turn to Mr. Flores as someone who works closely with developers and other entities and communities. What's your take on this point that small cities can't support a lot of new housing development because of infrastructure challenges?
Well, it's an interesting question because the path towards infrastructure is to build and provide more for sale housing. And I'll give you an example. So Encinitas is 95% single family neighborhoods. That means that if you live on a single family lot, you're living on the size of a basketball court with a home right in the middle. That's unsustainable. And if that's your finite pie, then your homeowners are already paying the property taxes that they can support. The only way out of that is to get new homeowners and to think of the land differently. And so The mayor of San Diego had a proposal to subdivide these basketball court-sized properties. When you start subdividing these properties, you lower the price point, but guess what? You also create new homeowners, which goes right back into cities for tax revenue. Perfect example, the city of San Diego. The city of San Diego collects $740 million in taxes. The value of real estate in our county is $787 billion. Let me say that again. The properties of the county are worth, residential, all of it, $787 billion. The city collects $740 million. That's not an equal number in any form or fashion. The cities are not collecting their fair share because they have an antiquated system of zoning, which does not allow them to capture the actual revenue that's buried in their cities. So it's an interesting dilemma that they face. And then, of course, if they are able to provide for that revenue, they can go to Wall Street and they can say to Wall Street, hey, give us a big bond. And Wall Street says, well, what's new in your city? Well, we're subdividing land to create middle-income home ownership opportunities. And Wall Street says, here's a couple billions of dollars. Go ahead and put that into your cities. By keeping your zoning in a certain antiquated way, you are going to not be able to realize the tax base that you have because of Prop 13. And Prop 13 is, no one's talking about getting rid of Prop 13. But if we're not going to get rid of Prop 13, we have to look at our land differently. So it's an interesting conversation. But if I was the state, I would be telling cities, you're very profitable. Your real estate's worth a lot. Are you getting what you need out of your real estate? And the answer is no. How can you be when when the majority of your real estate is sitting on basketball court sizes of land and a home right smack dab in the middle? You're not going to get what you want out of it. And so I frankly would say to the legislature, they've got to make these tough decisions, not the legislature, but the local governments need to make these tough decisions. And it was mentioned before about the public. At what point does the public's interest in housing supersede their desire not to have housing? I think every young person in this room would say, they need to create more housing opportunities. And I think that's the biggest problem we have here is we have two generations. We have a boomer generation, which is my parents, and we have a millennial generation, which is after me. I'm smack dab in the middle. I'm Generation X. These are two huge generations. This millennial generation is screaming for assistance in how to live in neighborhoods they grew up in. This boomer generation is saying, no. Something is going to give. Something is going to give. And I can guarantee you, the people in my position, the Generation X, we're just watching this massive titans go back and forth. And I can guarantee you who's going to win is the future. Young people are going to win this fight.
That brings me to my next question. There's something we hear a lot from leaders of small cities. I've heard, I think all the mayors and former mayor here say it before, is this concept of preserving community character. As mayors and former mayor of wealthy majority white cities, this can sometimes come across as an unwillingness to integrate other income levels into your cities. Is that the underlying message? I'll start with Mayor Bailey. Would you like to respond to that?
I think the question comes down to, well, what is the role of local government in housing? And from my perspective, I believe that the role of local government in housing is to create safe and vibrant communities that people actually want to live, work, and visit, given the unique constraints that each city faces. One of the difficult challenges from policies that are kind of more top-down policies from Sacramento down to the local governments is that it's impossible in a state that has over 400 cities to create policies that actually take into account the unique constraints that each city face. Cities don't actually decide who lives in their cities and who doesn't, right? Like, we all face these unique constraints. The market basically sets the prices, and whether or not people want to live in a particular city, given those market rate prices, determines who lives in cities. I do want to address a point that was made earlier, and that was regarding cities doing their part. And I think that's a really important question to answer. Like, well, how do we determine which cities are actually doing their part in regards to the housing issues in California? And I'm reminded of a conversation that happened a few years ago when SANDAG, our metropolitan planning organization, was allocating housing units to each one of the 19 cities within City County. And a point was brought up that the city of Coronado is one of the least densely populated cities in San Diego County. We have 35 square miles within our city boundaries, but we only have a population of approximately 25,000 residents. Coronado, you should be doing your part. And I had to remind this individual that of those 35 square miles, approximately 28 of them were water. So no matter how much we invest in our infrastructure, we're not going to add things like to Coronado. So 28 of the 35 square miles was water. Of the remaining 7 square miles, 3.5 square miles belong to the U.S. Navy. City of Coronado does not have land use authority over the U.S. Navy. 1/2 square miles of the remaining balance belong to the state of California. Another 1/2 square miles belong to the Port of San Diego. By California law, the Port of San Diego cannot build residential units on their land. And so that leaves the city of Coronado with approximately 1.5 square miles of land use authority, where we have currently 25,000 residents. That makes Coronado as densely populated as the city of San Francisco. So when I hear people say, oh, well, different cities need to do their part, I totally agree. But I would encourage us all to ask the question, well, what does doing your part look like? What metric do we want to establish as to whether or not a city is doing their part? I think it's also worth noting that although SANDAG was legally responsible for allocating housing units to all of the cities within the county, it is up to the state of California to enforce whether or not a city is compliant with their housing element. And so you have an entity that's allocating resources and then another entity that's kind of playing referee. And we've had high-level conversations with state officials, and there is a huge disconnect between how SANDAG allocates the resources and how the state of California is actually able to account for them. There's a quick example. Coronado has 11,000 housing units. We are allocated over 900 units to zone for this year, in large part due to the Navy base and the job centers on the Navy base. City of Coronado cannot count the jobs on the Navy base towards our housing element. And so that unfortunately creates a misalignment of incentives where, and I think the objective of creating workforce housing next to workforce centers is certainly, it's a positive objective, it's certainly a laudable objective, it's noble. But unless we align our incentives between the state, local governments, and these federal installations, we're missing a huge opportunity to actually accomplish those objectives. So to circle all the way back, we as a city don't actually control who lives in our city. We don't set the pricing for these housing units. And I think that's something that we have to take into account when we're setting policies at the state and local level.
If anyone wants to respond or anything, feel free to chime in also.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, one thing I'll just say is that cities have a really big role to play in housing because they actually set what we would call, as developers would call, a fixed rate, which is land. Everybody considers land a fixed rate. Well, it's only a fixed rate because government tells you how much you got to buy. In some neighborhoods, you got to buy a basketball court size piece of land or you got to rent it. If government said you don't have to buy 5,000 square feet, you could buy 1,000 square feet, that's going to be cheaper than 5,000 square feet. Government has a big role to play. They don't have a role to play in lumber or labor or all of those things, but they set the price for land. And so if they think of the price for land differently, it will lower land. And remember, this is a good problem to have, right? When San Diego passed zoning in 1923, San Diego was a city of about 100,000, right? Here we are 100 years later, we're a city of 1.3 million. We have a housing crisis because people want to live here. That's a good problem to have. Any mayor will tell you that's a good problem that people want to live in your city. The question is, how can you accommodate for that? And when the local governments are picking winners and losers by saying you have to buy all of this land to live in our jurisdiction, and there is no health or safety code reasons for that. In fact, the reason why you have to buy all that land is because the city of Berkeley in 1916 wanted to segregate out Black, Asian, and other immigrants. And so they said in a certain development, you have to buy 5,000 square feet of land. Never in the history of the United States had we ever heard of a single family zoning law until Berkeley came up with it. And Berkeley was actually pretty forward thinking because just so happened the next year in 1917, the Supreme Court got rid of deeds and covenants. But guess what? We're still with single family zoning, and single family zoning is the deeds and covenant restrictions, and they're still alive and being enforced up and down our state to this day.
You're the only one who's getting applause.
Well, I'm not elected, so it's a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm not elected.
I'll just add a couple things that occur to me as my very informed fellow panelists are speaking and sharing their perspectives. So one of them is that I think local government officials are always elected in part on a preserving community character perspective when they represent coastal cities. So having community character, people who live in communities self-select. So they usually like those communities and they want to keep the things about them that they like, the reasons they chose those cities. But my perspective is that we can add housing while retaining community character. And in many ways we need to, because if we don't add more housing, community character will change because the diversity will be priced out. So it's diversity of everything in age, in income, in race, in background, ethnicity. We want to create more opportunities for people to be able to integrate into communities that they may have been excluded from. And so adding housing and in coastal communities like the two on either side of me and many others, this is really very incremental. The amount of housing that's being added is really, it's not going to transform the community. It's adding accessory dwelling units and just sprinkling density in a gentle density type of way. It's adding a few apartment complexes. It's allowing SB9 allows for a quad to be built where there used to be just one home. So these are all ways to add housing that largely does not disturb community character. So I never saw community character as being at odds with adding housing, but I know many people do define it that way in their minds. But it's really important as when you're thinking about solving these big problems, I think that we reorient ourselves in that way. The other point I want to make, and this is relevant and on top of my mind because the front page of the business section today in the San Diego Union Tribune was about vacancy rates. And what it said was that there are 6% of homes in San Diego County are vacant. And they're vacant for different reasons. Some of them, they're vacation rentals, they're second homes, they're on the market to be sold or people haven't moved into them yet. But my understanding is the city of Coronado actually has a 25% vacancy rate with the homes that are there. And some cities have made efforts because they want communities, they want people to live in communities. They have vacancy taxes and they have efforts to try to create the opportunity for homes. Coronado, like Encinitas, one of the things that we partnered on and I was very happy about is passing a cap on vacation rentals. So Coronado has a 1% cap and so do we, basically roughly, there's some nuance in there, but saying that your housing stock can't all become hotel rooms because we want people to live in communities. And so when you have a vast number that are becoming vacation rentals, then you are losing your neighborhoods. And we can see that could happen at really high numbers if we don't put some type of cap on it. But it's also really important we have some, right? So we want to make sure we have that diversity in our neighborhoods of some opportunities to rent a home, but also mostly people who live there. So I think when I think about the housing picture, we're eating away at the problem in many different ways. And so some of these things, they're relatively small. They're adding density, they're addressing vacancies. But there are ways that we will eventually be able to hopefully solve or at least reduce the housing crisis that we have in the state.
Yes, community character is important, and I am fortunate. I married a woman who had a father who was quite the community character, and to me, that's the most important part of community character is the people. So we want to focus on having a vertical community character income-wise as opposed to a horizontal one, which just continues to increase in incidence. And you know, look, I can decry the commoditization of housing. I see the problems that it has created. Ricardo is terribly out of touch. He has no idea what we're up against. And so don't expect zoning to go away anytime soon. In the meantime, what I will say is that we have done what was required by the law, because I believe in the rule of law, and I look forward to continuing to stay compliant with state housing element law. And so we're building apartments. We have just approved a project that involved townhomes for sale. So this was our first for sale project. All the other half dozen were essentially rental projects. So in the end, this is one of those things that we will continue to work to comply. I have 3 children. I have 5 grandchildren. I am very much a beneficiary of intergenerational wealth. The house that my wife grew up in, I live in. We've remodeled it. We made room for my mother-in-law. My wife was a nurse. She took care of my mother-in-law to her death in the house. And we're not looking to sell the house. We're looking to have generational wealth to the next generations. My daughter bought a home in the barrio in Oceanside. My son, who's a tech pro, came from Oakland, bought a home in Vista, $1.1 million starter home. How crazy is that? My middle son lives with us. My sister lives with us. I'm fighting the housing battle because I live it. And this notion that I'm trying to avoid building more housing in our community is just wrong. And I look forward to continuing to fight. The project that we just approved, that is the townhome model, we were sued for it, approving it. So litigation, it seems never ending. We've got another project that we approved almost 14 months ago that is going to be at a coastal commission hearing coming up next week, because the coastal commission decided to interject and has been holding up the project. So it's one thing after another, and it is very frustrating at times. Finally, let me say that SB 9, we are living with SB 9, but I will point out that that is not going to move the needle on housing. I live next door to a duplex that recently sold for $2.3 million. The notion that we're going to be able to build duplexes in Encinitas that will be affordable is just a fantasy. So we have the challenge of the commoditization of land and housing, and we're not going to get past that anytime soon.
Mayor, did you want to respond, Mayor Bailey? Is that? Yes.
I do. I think Tony's spot on, but a lot of his comments are kind of just reality of what the government have today. I'm reminded of an old saying by econ professor in college said, and the professor said that oftentimes the laws of economics are stronger than the laws of physics. The laws of economics are stronger than the laws of physics. I'm reminded of that because in the context of SB 9, where you might think, hey, if you own a home in Coronado, for example, in Diaz or Del Mar, and you can now by right demolish your single family residence and put up 4 units in this place, you might think to yourself, oh, that'd be a great financial decision. And that might also increase the supply of housing, which then might reduce the cost of housing. And I was having this conversation with a resident of mine, and she would be the first to admit she probably is on the left side of the political spectrum, and said, you know, she would describe herself as a YIMBY, and she came to our council meeting and she said, hey, Richard, you know, you need to do more. Coronado needs to do more with housing. And I asked her, I said, do you still live on this particular block, this particular address? She says, yes. I said, well, just so you know, you are able to tear down your single family home and build 4 units in this place. Like, you can do that right now by right. You don't need any approval from the city of Coronado. And I asked her, would you consider doing that? And she said, well, no, of course not, because I like where I live and I like my single family home. And so I just couldn't help but smile at that. And this, you know, this is a great woman. She's a great community member. And I understand where her heart is at. And I understand, I think, where all of our thoughts are at and our desires are at to see the price of housing reduce. But once again, the laws of economics tend to be stronger than the laws of physics. So if you don't have people that are willing to take advantage of SB 9, you're not actually going to see the supply of housing increase in some areas, once again, because of the market conditions specific to those areas.
Kind of along those lines of what you're saying, Mayor Bailey, Coronado right now doesn't have a compliant housing element. It's not the only city in California that doesn't have a compliant housing element. But do you feel like Coronado's leaders have made a good faith effort to make those strides and get into compliance with state housing laws?
The short answer to the question is yes, I do. And the reason I say that is because we have submitted housing plans last year that were rejected by the state because the state raised certain objections. And so we're doing our best right now to be compliant with the state housing element. We are working closely with the state. And I think within the next 2 weeks, the city council will be considering a housing element that will make us compliant. So I do think we are certainly doing our part. And I would raise the question to all of us here, including here today. What does success look like? It's easy, I think, for all of us to say that we would like housing to be more affordable, but how much more affordable? The average rent in Coronado is $3,700. The average rent in El Cajon is $2,000. There are approximately half the households in the United States make less than $75,000 per year. It is our objective to have housing here in San Diego County, and specifically maybe along the coast, affordable for half the households in the US to make less than $75,000 a year. Is that the objective? If not, what is the objective? Like, and how do we know we're actually achieving success? So that's the question I would leave up to all of you and everyone up here on this panel. But in short, yes, I do think we are certainly doing our part to try to be compliant with the state housing element.
Okay, and so I guess what I'm hearing you say, do you believe then that Coronado and city governments have an obligation to make sure that there's housing for a variety of income levels?
The city doesn't set the price for the housing that exists within the city. The market does. I'm just curious, like, show of hands, who here would like to live in Coronado for $1,500 a month? So would I. So would I. And now, who here would like to live in the middle of South Dakota in the winter for $1,500 a month? And so this is just a market. You like the gold. So this is just a market reality that more people on average are willing to pay more for housing along the coast than they are in other places. And so the idea that local government can actually control for and set aside housing for certain income levels really kind of ignores, as a lot of those goals might be, it really kind of ignores the market reality is that people generally, more people on average want to live in certain areas than others.
I just have one thing.
Yeah.
Just really briefly. I mean, one thing that I think is really important to add to that is that when we have new housing developments, most cities have an inclusionary ordinance that requires 10 to 15 to 20% be deed restricted affordable. So when we're adding new housing, in Encinitas, we were really aggressive, and the two of us spent a lot of time on this specific topic of how much affordability can we require. And because the units still have to pencil in order for a developer to build that, you can't require 50% affordable or 75% affordable. But going as high as possible means that when you do have new housing that's built, there is 10%, 20% that is deed restricted affordable that does give the opportunity for more people to enter these communities than if housing is not built. So I just want to add that as a part of it.
And I would add that the challenge is the way we come to this conversation in this notion of affordable. Encinitas has a bunch of businesses that are very retail oriented, lower wage jobs, and therefore the difficulty that we have is that most of that workforce cannot afford affordable, because affordable is defined as the area median income, 80% of the area median income is low income. But guess what? My daughter, who was a barista at Starbucks for 10 years, didn't get anywhere near low income. She was very low income. And they're not building very many low income restricted units in Encinitas. And even if there would be 3,000 people that wanted to get in them. So it's like winning the lottery. So the whole gig is just great. And we really need to rethink RENA. We need to think the notion of workforce housing. I'm playing by the rules as they were set. Do I wish they were different? Yes, that's why I was very supportive of Catherine getting to Sacramento, because she experienced this. And I was hoping that we would see some movement towards, a dose of reality into the housing laws. And I think she'll come around. I've never seen a whole lot. 423 for one. So I consider all the council members that I've served with
more like siblings, so we may disagree on some things, but we'll continue to argue and fight and advocate for what we think is the right strategy.
I would like to kind of piggyback off of this notion of inclusionary housing. What we've seen happen here in San Diego County is that the median home price in San Diego County has increased by 83% in the last 8 years. So from 2015 up to today, median home price for a home in San Diego County today is just under $1 million. Now, prices are a signal to the marketplace, and as prices increase, that tells the marketplace to produce more of this product. So what would you guess has happened in terms of housing production since 2015? So once again, home prices are up by 83% since 2015. How much do you think housing starts are up in San Diego County since 2015? Zero. They're flat. On average, San Diego County produces about 10,000 units per year. That should beg the question to all of us. If the market is saying we need more housing because the price is going up, why aren't we actually seeing more housing? And to dive down deeper, why aren't we seeing more middle class housing being built? And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons for it touches on inclusionary housing. And it also touches on where new housing projects are allowed to be built. Beginning in around 2000, prior to 2005, when you would look at a forward projection of where housing will be built in San Diego County, like at a map produced by Sandag, what you would find is that there is a lot more new developments in the East County part of San Diego, where there's an abundance of land relative to the coast. It is cheaper to build where there's open space than it is an infill development along the coast, where you have to deal with a lot more coastal regulations. There's already very expensive developments. So on average, developing in East County is cheaper than it is along the coast. But then around 2010, when you started looking at these forward-looking projections on where new housing is going to be allowed, what you found is that all of that housing that was previously envisioned to be built out in East County has now been relegated almost entirely, probably about 85–90% of it to almost west of 5, like right along the I-5 corridor, where there's already a lot of existing developments. So that means that a developer, if they would want to develop on the I-5 corridor, they're almost certainly purchasing land that already has expensive developments on it. So they're paying a premium for that land to develop. And so what that means is they're going to have to charge a premium for the units that actually get developed there. And so that requires then the developers to build high-end homes. So homes for high-income individuals. With the inclusionary component here, developers are allowed to have these density bonuses to build even more units, provided that they build a certain percentage of them per deed-restricted low-income residents. And that's great. However, what that does is you now have 10%, 15% of these homes that have low-income residents, and you have the rest of the homes that have to, just because of how the market works to make these projects pencil out, are now only priced for high-income individuals. Meanwhile, the middle-class housing that could have otherwise been built has been taken out of inventory because that land is no longer available to build on. And I think this is where you have two competing objectives from the state of California. Yeah. Yep. Okay. I think this is where you have an example of two competing priorities from the popular guy. This is where you have two competing priorities from the state of California. On the one hand, the state of California says, we want to have affordable housing for everyone. On the other hand, they say, hey, we want to be really good stewards of the environment and reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled. Great objectives, but they are sometimes at odds with each other. And this is why, by reducing the number of vehicle miles traveled that projects are allowed to count towards their projects in East County, that takes a lot of that inventory of land, makes it unavailable. So in the name of being a good pro-environment, we've removed a lot of this land, but then it has the unintended consequence of reducing the inventory of land, which then drives up prices for new housing.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna take a couple questions from the audience, which I have here that you guys have submitted. This is for Mayor Bailey. It's also, I'm adding in kind of a question that I have also. You've mentioned inclusionary housing, the concept of, the government doesn't set the prices for homes. The question is, don't the housing development policies the city set and enforce affect how much housing and what type of housing is available, which affects prices and thus who can? And the part that I want to add is the housing element, a key part of it is providing or accommodating for housing for a variety of income levels. So because Coronado doesn't have the housing element compliant, doesn't that kind of get at, trying to provide the housing for a variety of income levels? I know the government doesn't set the prices, but the housing element is kind of aiming to get at that in order to provide the housing for all income levels.
Short answer is yes, that is the objective of the housing element. And the state uses for this arena exercise a proxy for affordability in the form of density. And so the state recognizes that projects that are at 29 units per acre or greater count towards your affordability score on your housing element, on your price. Show of hands real quick. Who's been in Coronado? Right, everyone's been in Coronado. If you can imagine just for a quick second, the Hotel Del, and just south of the Hotel Del, there are these 10 large towers. Kind of, you might be able to picture those. So if those towers did not exist today, and the city of Coronado were to include them in our housing element, that would actually count towards our affordability score. The problem with that is that the cheapest condo you can find in those towers is about $2.5 million. And so that's where, once again, the city can try our best to set zoning, even high density zoning like those towers, but the market effects probably won't achieve the desired result, despite the best of our ability, or despite the best of our efforts.
I was in Coronado in 1977 for my senior prom. It was Hotel Del. It was great. Yes, it was a great time. But I also know that there was a lot of workforce there that is not able to live in Coronado, and that's so traffic over the bridge, traffic through all our cities, traffic on all the freeways. So the idea of creating workforce housing, I think, should be the biggest objective we have right now. The fact of the matter is, we've approved projects in Encinitas that have hundreds of units in the pipeline to be built. The only affordable housing that we're getting are the deed restricted units. And in fact, all the rest, even in the apartments that have 1,200 square foot apartments, they are above moderate income because of the price that is projected to those units to rent for. So essentially, what we're doing is we're accommodating with all these development projects the wealthy who will move to our city and enjoy a beautiful city. But the workforce, they still have to drive in from Temecula and other areas around the county that increases vehicle miles traveled, which contributes to greenhouse gases, and all of the things that I recognize are really bad for future generations. So my grandchildren, will they have a planet that is habitable? I can't say that with certainty. So for me, the goal is to create state laws that allow for cities to approve workforce housing, that allows for the apartments that are built to go to people who work in our city. And I think that will go a long ways towards addressing some of the issues that we have with no longer the question of affordability, but having a community that has an integrated group of residents.
My father was a chef at Coronado Hotel, and he commuted from Tijuana because we couldn't afford it.
Sorry, sir. I have questions over here. Sorry about that. For Senator Blakespear, a question from the audience. If a city has vacant land it owns and wants to develop, what is the purpose of the Surplus Land Act?
Well, the Surplus Land Act is designed to move land into housing development, and that's really what its goal is. One of the things that concerns me about publicly owned land is moving publicly owned land into private ownership. So my preference is always to encourage the 99-year lease or the 30-year lease, because the future is uncertain, obviously, we don't know what future crises will be, and we want to be able to have public land be available for the uses that the future might need it for. So I think one of the things that's really important to his point about workforce housing, I mean, the reality that we have to always remember is that the private market produces most housing. So the government is not building housing. The government has all these complicated ways of trying to incentivize private developers, but the government builds like prisons. It doesn't build housing, it doesn't build social housing. It also doesn't, we don't build public housing. So and when you think about uses of the state money, you know, we have a homelessness crisis, we have a border crisis, we have a water crisis, we have a climate crisis. So I don't see an appetite in Sacramento to have large amounts of money go into building public housing. That's not something that's imminent, at least at the state level. And I'm sure people to my right, in many ways, people to my right would be happy to hear that the government's not about to get involved in building large amounts of public housing. But you know, thinking about how do you really build workforce housing when housing is built by the private market that needs to make a profit? If this is the big struggle. And so by providing workforce housing, if we're not doing it by incentivizing more density, we don't want to sprawl into the backcountry where there's habitat and we want there to be open spaces. So densifying our communities, at least to some degree, is really the only way that we're able to do that.
Can I follow up real quick on that? The federal government, believe it or not, has a fairly decent program. It's called Section 8, and it's run through HUD. And we have about a 20-year waiting list for Section 8 housing in Encinitas. Imagine if the state decided that they were going to start a voucher program where it was a partnership between government and the private market, where we could incentivize private property owners to make their rental properties available through this program. I'm not asking the state to get involved in building houses, but I do think that the power of the purse on this particular issue is critical because, as I pointed out, majority of our workforce in Encinitas can't afford even very low income housing. So until the government steps up to help with vouchers, I think we're going to be in this vicious circle of just building, you know, luxury apartments in Encinitas, which is very unfortunate in my opinion.
And just to piggyback off some of those comments, the state of California does provide or has historically provided cities with some amount of funding, notably through redevelopment, which expired back in 2012. And a quick story on that. So City of Coronado, we had just under $4 million available that we could only use for deed restricted housing. And we actually looked at partnering with other cities that were more affordable cities and giving this money to them so they could purchase more housing units within their city and, you know, in our small way, help address the housing issues we face in the region and have those numbers count towards our RENA goals. And we were told that we couldn't do that. So rather than let this money expire and have to move it back to the state, the city of Coronado, once again, we wanted to get stewards of the taxpayer funds. We ended up spending just under $4 million on a, for all intents and purposes, a fairly dilapidated duplex on one of the busiest streets in Coronado. Now it will be deed restricted, but there's 2 units right there for roughly $4 million. And I don't think any of us in this room that pay taxes think that that's probably the best use of tax dollars. So there is a real struggle with getting government funding to build quote unquote affordable housing.
Mayor Bailey, I have a question for the audience. What will Coronado's legal strategy be when the Attorney General sues them for their housing element?
And I mean this sincerely, I really do. The city of Coronado, we are making a calculated good faith effort to do our part. As I mentioned earlier, we're densely populated as the city of San Francisco, and to my knowledge, we're the most densely populated city when you consider land use, the availability of land use, your land use authority within your city, in the entire community. Now, as it relates to that, once again, the housing element, in each city's unique constraints, one thing that SANDAC didn't take into account when we were being assigned our units is that Coronado, like in cities like Del Mar, is entirely within the coastal zone. So we have a 30-foot height limit. It also didn't take into account that we have an airport in our city. And so because of FAA regulations and also additional regulations from the state of California, about a quarter of our land use authority cannot be identified legally. So like state of California prohibits us from increasing density over the border or land use area to begin with. And so these are the types of unique constraints I'm talking about that make it really difficult to be compliant with the housing element. I will say that we have had a great working relationship with the state of California agencies that are looking into enforcement of the city's housing element, and I'm confident that within the next couple of weeks, we will have a compliant housing element.
I'll say one thing to remember about the housing elements is they've been around since like the 1960s. So cities have been doing this for decades now. What's different now is that the California YIMBY movement actually put teeth and the legislature put teeth to these old laws that nobody thought about. And that was an incredible strategy. And so much so that we saw in San Diego, for example, they've been on automatic pilot with their arenas. They put an actual cemetery plot as a potential housing site. That's the challenge here, is that you have cities, I think, that have been an automatic pilot for so long. And now the discussion is, well, you have to build housing. And nobody is talking about making huge investments of infrastructure and things like that. What we're saying is you have to look at your zoning differently. And your zoning doesn't cost money to change. It's just staff time, but the staffs are going to be there in perpetuity. You're talking about a city. And zoning, by the way, is just a figment of your imagination. Why do we have to live on a basketball court size home or lot? You don't have to, actually. And I think that's the real challenge here, is that it seems like this issue is so complicated and there's so many things we have to do. But the reality is it's not that complicated. It's that we have to change our style of zoning and give people more property rights, which will then increase their value of their property, which will then they can consider subdividing that property for money or to build new housing for themselves or their family. Once we get down that path, then we'll start to see the changes we really want. But before we get down there, and I think the other thing I wanted to point out too is this housing crisis is so acute that I help build affordable housing. So people who really can't pay or don't have cash flow, that's really what I do and with some of the developers here. But you're not only lumping in people at that level, you're lumping in middle income people. You're lumping in people that actually have money, that can't afford a place to live. And again, I stress this, and I can't stress this enough. If a city will allow you to buy 1,000 square feet of land versus 5,000 square feet of land, the cost will drop significantly. And if you allow that to happen, the market will price it accordingly. And if you allow it through all of your community, you won't distort your community because you won't have little things here and there popping up. There is a way out of this. It's just that we have a belief historically that we have a way of our neighborhoods looking a certain way. But remember, this is what's fascinating about single family zoning. Very few Americans actually lived in single family zoning. My grandfather, who grew up and went to World War II, he didn't live in a single family home. But guess what? After World War II, my dad did. I grew up in a single family home. If I had kids, they would be growing up in a single family home. Nowhere in history, in American history, have we seen that, let alone see that around the world, believe it or not. And again, ask yourself, where did this zoning come from that we're all fighting to preserve? And it came from a very nefarious reason, to segregate people. And if it wasn't successful, then we could say, like where I live in Kensington, you could say, well, Kensington's actually a brown and black neighborhood. No, it's not. Nobody in this room believes that. There may be brown and black people living in Kensington, myself included, but the picture of our cities remains the same. If you look at the redlining maps in the 1930s, the city of San Diego, the same neighborhoods that were exclusive, are still expensive, still have the same families in there, still have the same picture of the children going to the same schools. Something is fundamentally wrong, and that something is that cities, local cities, force us to buy an amount of land that is in excess of what we need to survive and live in a modern society.
Mr.
in San
Flores,
Diego.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
It's about that time. So unfortunately, I have to wrap it up. But thank you guys so much for joining us. This was a great discussion. And yeah, we appreciate all of your time.